economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View
across America. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news. Right off the bat, we're going to spend some time talking about how to really begin to think about this war on terror, and in particular, I've posted a very good piece, General McMaster squanders tremendous capital Trump earns in Saudi Arabia. And of course, we have talked a little bit about the speech by President Donald Trump when he was over there in front of more than 50 Muslim leaders. We'll get back to that in just a minute, but also talk about how sometimes individuals, in trying to address the issue of terrorism or trying to defend the idea of a travel ban or extreme vetting, individuals sometimes say, well, it's not about Islam. Well, it isn't, and it is. And so we'll get into some of that. And the author of this article that we've posted here on the website is an individual who's been on the program with us many times before, Ken Timmerman, a nationally recognized investigative reporter, a war correspondent. Matter of fact, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago in his expose of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Also an individual who lectures at the Pentagon's Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy. At one time, he was a candidate for Congress, and also has written quite a number of books. When we talk about the persecuted Christians, sometimes we mention some of the material that he's put together, Christians of Iraq, and one book that I might also commend to you, Dark Forces, The Truth About What Happened in Benghazi. Ken Timmerman, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Kirby, thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure.
It is always great to hear from you. And this particular article that we've posted here, which was in front page, is, I think, again, an example of something we've talked about in the past. When, for example, individuals in the Trump administration would go out on the talking head shows and they'd say, well, this travel ban or this idea of extreme vetting, it's not about religion. Well, it is and it isn't. And so when you have this General McMaster, going out of many different times and saying, well, those people that are part of ISIS or the Islamic State are not Islamic people, it's not helpful to really having a clear understanding of who our enemy is. So explain, if you might.
Well, that's right. And I thought this was tremendously important, especially after the president's speech in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where he really laid out very clearly his vision. And he said, we have a problem with Islamic terrorism. Those are the words that he used. And all of the Muslim leaders who were gathered there to listen to were there shaking their heads. Yes, we do have this problem. We understand that there's this problem that exists. They know it. They see it in their midst. They understand that the people who are blowing themselves up and establishing a self-proclaimed caliphate in Iraq and in Syria are drawing their example from the early days of Muhammad and from the verses of the Quran, and they understand this very well. And they understand that it's a virus at the heart of Islam that needs to be countered, and only Muslims can counter it. So when McMaster, who's the national security advisor, comes out just hours after Trump gives this speech, where he calls a spade, and he talks to Muslims with truth, McMaster says, "Oh no, this has nothing to do with Islam. These people are just criminals. They have a political agenda. They're not religious whatsoever." It really makes you wonder if McMaster has any loyalty to the President of the United States and whether he actually subscribes to Donald Trump's vision of the world.
Let's see if we can dig into this for just a little bit, and that is, you point out and others point out that if you go through the Quran, and some of us have taken the time to read it and others have heard about it, you come up with more than 100 verses, and I think in your article here there's a list of 164 verses which in one way or another show Muhammad calling for Muslims to fight unbelievers. Now, again, these were happening later when he is in Medina, not Mecca, but I think any fair Muslim has to at least acknowledge that those are there and that they are used by radical Muslims, by Islamists, to actually justify what they do. And when we simply pretend that they're not there, or that this is a terrible perversion of this great religion of the Middle East, we don't really, first of all, affirm those moderate Muslims who want to bring about change. And number two, we, I think, do dishonest to really the academic scholarship behind it, don't we?
Very, very well said. Absolutely. By the way, I want to reassure our listeners, I did not list 104 verses.
You got the link,
about killing the unbeliever. I just put a link in there, so you can go and look at the.
You can look at the link. Yes, well said.
It gets pretty long, but no, absolutely right. And let me tell you, I learned about Islam in the Middle East. I spent many years earlier in my career in the 1980s and 1990s in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, going back and forth. And where I interacted with Muslims every single day because there weren't very many Christians except those who were getting murdered in Iraq many years later. But, you know, I learned about Islam on the ground. And one of the things that I learned that most of these societies, now this is before the Arab Spring, okay, this is before the advent of the Muslim Brotherhood turned violence and extremists. This is before the advent of Al-Qaeda. There is a traditional society in Muslim in the Muslim world, which is actually very family oriented, very welcoming to outsiders, very hospitable. But it has been traduced over the past 20 years, and you'll be really hard pressed to go find it today. What's happened today is that these predominantly young men, but they're not all young, through Al Qaeda, through the Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam. They have used the tenets of the Muslim faith to radicalize young people, to call for jihad, to call for murder against the unbeliever, so much so that you cannot even recognize the beauty of those traditional societies anymore.
You know, one of the things you also talk about here is if you look at the training manuals, and I know you've seen some of them, the propaganda videos, and I know you're familiar with some of those, ISIS or the Islamic State really is calling upon young Muslims to join in the jihad. And if you go back even to the bomber there in Manchester, England, or some of these others, again, they are appealing to these various texts and they're appealing to some of this propaganda material, aren't they?
Right, and this is the problem with Islam. It's as if the Quran is kind of like a latent gene in the DNA of Muslims around the world. For most of them, it will never burst out, it will never become dominant. But for others, it comes to the fore, and it's called jihad, and it's called violence. The other place I learned about Islam, Kirby, and I think it's kind of interesting to share this with our listeners, was from a Shiite Iranian Ayatollah, a dissident Ayatollah from Iran. And I worked with him. I got to know him in Paris in the 1980s, and later he came on the board of my Foundation for Democracy in Iran, which helps the pro-freedom movement in Iran. And he acknowledged, he was the first to acknowledge these verses in the Quran. And he taught me early on that Islam in itself draws the world into two halves, the house of war and the house of Islam. If you are in the house of Islam, then everything's okay. You are governed by Islamic law. But if you are outside, if you are a non-believer, you are in the house of war, and righteous Muslims have a duty to carry out jihad against you. And he said, this is what's in Islam, and if we want to promote a peaceful vision of Islam, we have to counter that as Muslims and as clerics. Hard to do.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Ken Timmerman. We have his article on the website, pointofview.net. I do commend it to you. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Was an ABC sitcom canceled due to Hollywood politics? Some viewers think so and started an online petition calling for a boycott of ABC. 2 weeks ago, ABC News announced that they were cutting Tim Allen's show, The Last Man Standing. He responded with a short Twitter announcement that said, "Stunned and blindsided by the network I called home for the last 6 years." Some viewers point to the show's cancellation as a clear victim of an attack on conservatives. On the surface, it would seem that the family comedy about a man who has strong conservative opinions about politics and culture got the axe because of his views. The show has been the mainstay of ABC's Friday schedule. It has an average of about 6 million viewers. That is more than ABC shows Blackish and Shark Tank, more than the ABC show The Goldbergs, which just scored a 2-year renewal for a 5th and 6th season. It's also worth mentioning that The Last Man Standing has also done very well in syndication. The network contends that money was the issue. Each year, apparently, there was wrangling over the license fee for the program between ABC and 20th Century Fox TV. Also, the fee is higher than for other programs because of the salary that Tim Allen receives for the show. Money might be the reason, or money might be the excuse. I don't really know, but it does remind me of the comments we heard from department stores that dropped the Ivanka Trump line of fashions. Was it the lack of profitability of her fashion line, or was it the fact that executives of the stores hated her father? It's hard to tell. Some speculate that the show might move to Fox TV since 20th Century Fox TV already owns the show. It might also end up on Hallmark or Netflix. That might be a better fit for a show that makes conservative comments that don't go over so well with Hollywood executives. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And Timmerman with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, by the way, 1-800-351-1212. We will have a little more open line in the latter part of this hour, and then we'll also talk about the trip that President Trump took, and we'll get into some of that in just a minute. Which is his website. You can find out a lot about some of his books. Those of you interested in Benghazi, of course, I mentioned his book, Dark Forces, The Truth About What Happened in Benghazi. Also a book called Deception, The Making of the YouTube Video Hillary and Obama Blamed for Benghazi, as well as Shadow Warriors, and a variety of other books that over the years we've had a chance to talk about with him. But Ken, since we did mention Trump's speech there, Donald Trump's speech, President Trump really is speaking in front of more than 50 Muslim leaders. And I was very impressed. Here he talks about the opening of a global center for combating extremist ideology, recognizing it's not just a military battle, it's an ideological battle. He talks about the fact that something we've mentioned on this program many times before, the greatest threat to a Muslim is another Muslim. Talked about more than 95% of the victims of terrorism are themselves Muslims. Actually put Hamas and Hezbollah in the same category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and then called out Iran as a place that actually funds, arms, and trains terrorists, militias, and other extremist groups. If you wanted to talk about a speech that, say, you or I or many of our friends would write, I think it checked a lot of those boxes, didn't it?
He did. And again, the fascinating thing was to watch the reaction of Muslim leaders to President Trump saying these things, for telling the truth about the terrorism that we faced, which comes from Muslims and from Muslims who have subscribed to the jihadi ideology. They all understood what he was saying. They knew it was true. So you cannot defeat an ideology by sugarcoating the threat, which is what General McMaster tried to do. You have to really describe it in clear terms, tell people what it is, and then go and defeat it ideologically as well as militarily. And that's what he was calling on Muslim leaders to do. And I think he's going to get a great deal of cooperation from the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians in particular are going to be very, very willing to help out in this battle.
What about this idea of Iran? Because we've had this conversation before as well. Government that he describes gives safe harbor financial backing and social standing needed for recruitment. So we have a very striking difference between the previous administration that was really trying to develop even back channels and relationships with Iran, and this president who's calling them out. And don't I remember you writing something about there might even be a connection between Iran and Benghazi? I know you've done a lot of research on that. Help us out with any of the things that you've learned about Iran and how that relates to some of the issues we've been talking about here in the news.
Well, first, vis-a-vis the trip to Riyadh, I think what the president has done is assemble an anti-Islamic State of Iran posse. And he's got these other leaders from the region together who themselves feel tremendously threatened by the Iranian regime, which is the first Islamic State. Let's not forget that, before ISIS. And they are very much looking for U.S. leadership. They're looking for U.S. help. And they want us to not just contain Iran, they would really like us to, if at all possible, help find ways of undermining the Islamic dictatorship in Iran. And that's something I think you're going to see this administration looking at. When it comes to Benghazi, the Iranians were directly involved in the attack. And I lay out exactly how that happened in my new book, Deception, the making of YouTube video that Obama and Hillary blamed for Benghazi. There are memos that have now been declassified from the Defense Intelligence Agency that talk about the Quds Force. This is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran, the Quds Force Expeditionary, kind of like their special forces, if you wish. They were on the ground in Benghazi. They recruited the actual terrorists who carried out the attacks. They did the logistics for it. They paid the money to train them. They gave these guys weapons. And I believe, my information is, it was actual Iranian special operations guys who launched the mortars that killed the two Navy SEALs in the last minutes of the attack.
So again, I would mention for those of you maybe taking some notes, because I know some of you do, Quds Force would be Quds, Quds Force. And again, you can actually type in Ken Timmerman's name. You'll find some of the links that provide that as well. Just before we go, let's talk about what is available on your website, because I think this is a great place for people to know a little bit more about you, to read some of your books. Probably already you've encouraged a few people to think about getting a copy of your latest book, Deception, or some of the others, or if they would want to contact you or schedule you for speaking, they can go to kentimmerman.com. And if you don't know how to spell it, the good news is we have a link there. But talk about what's available on your website if people want to contact you.
Sure. Thank you, Kirby. I appreciate that. Well, the first thing I do is I put my most current article right up at the top so you can see it and click on that. And then there's a link to earlier articles that I've done. I do generally a couple of columns a week on foreign policy, national security issues. And, of course, there are links to all of my book. And each book has its own page on the website that will give you an idea of what it's all about. You don't have to buy the books if you don't want to. You can look at them. There are links there. I've put a lot of documentation, because these are investigative books, a lot of documentation online that you can click to and look at for free. It's all up there. My book on Iraqi Christians is called St. Peter's Bones, and it started out as a nonfiction book, but I made it into a novel because nobody was interested in a book about the blood of the martyrs. This was a couple of years ago, Kirby. Today, there are fewer and fewer of those martyrs left. But some of the research for that book is also online, St. Peter's Bones, at my website, kentimmerman.com.
You know, and of course, this weekend we had Memorial Day, and of course, we tend to honor those in military service. But as we talk about Benghazi, we still need to remember Ambassador Chris Stevens and Sean Smith and Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. And of course, you have information about that on the website. Anybody that would like to understand more about Benghazi, you have 2 different books, lots of articles that people can read and understand what actually took place there, and maybe a lesson we can learn in the future in terms of how to protect protect our embassies. So all sorts of great material there, and all of it available at the website. And if people would like to have you come and speak or address some of these foreign policy issues at their group, that's available too, isn't it?
Absolutely right. There's an about page about me, and there's contact information. You can email me directly. You can also follow me on Twitter, Ken Timmerman at Twitter, or whatever it is. But you can at Ken Timmerman, I guess it is. I like to tweet. Me and Donald Trump, although his tweets get a lot more.
A lot more. Yes, he does.
But it's a lot of fun, unless you put out links to stories that I'm reading and commentary.
I might just mention we've made it real easy because right next to, if you click on the picture that says see more, go down to the bio, right next to the name Ken Timmerman, you will see both the Twitter and Facebook links. So that should give you everything that you need. And again, Ken, it is great to have you on the program. Thank you for writing this article. Let's do this again sometime soon.
Thank you, Kirby. It's a great pleasure to be with you. God bless.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me open up the phones because we've talked about how to really address this issue of Islam. And this is something I think that I'd love to get your thoughts about. There are some that have said, it has nothing to do with Islam, and we've already sort of addressed that. And then some that'll say, well, it has everything to do with Islam. Well, no, there are a lot of moderate Muslims. I need to bring some more of them on the program here who say, there are some ways to address some of those verses. And again, in this particular article, it has a link to the 164 verses that in one way or another Muhammad called for an attack on unbelievers. Many times they will contextualize them or in one way or another remove the virulence that we see in the radical Muslim world. But I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. In this next half hour, before we get into our conversation with Dr. Merrill Matthews in the second hour, where we're going to talk a little bit about trade and as well about this idea of the Paris treaty dealing with climate change. But mostly we bring Dr. Merrill Matthews on to address the issue of health care. And a lot of you have some really significant questions right now about repeal and replace the American Health Care Act. What would happen if indeed this passes the Senate? What about pre-existing conditions? We're going to get into all of that in the second hour. But before we do, I thought we would keep this conversation going for just a few more minutes. First of all, to look at, again, the speech given by President Donald Trump in the Arab world. Then some of the surveys that have come out that say that most Americans today are convinced that we are not winning the war against ISIS or the Islamic State. And then another piece that I want to bring to the table, which comes from our friend Andrew McCarthy, about the fact that during the previous administration, the National Security Agency routinely intercepted and reviewed communications by us, American citizens, in violation of the Constitution and even some of the guidelines that were established by federal law. So if you'd like to join us on some of the conversation we're going to have in this last half hour here, in this first hour, you can join us. That number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some phone calls and continue our conversation right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. And she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the truth team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Open line if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Opened up with a conversation with Ken Timmerman. A little bit later, as I mentioned, in the second hour, we'll have in studio with us Dr. Merrill Matthews, and you can ask all the questions you would like about the Health Care Reform Acts that exist, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or the American Health Care Act, to repeal and replace, what that's going to mean for you in terms of insurance. What about Medicare, Medicaid? We'll get into all of that with him, and he's also posted a couple of other things that I thought you would be interested in. One about the Paris Agreement on climate change. He's just posted one today about some of the things Donald Trump has said about trade. So we'll get into those for a few minutes, but then spend most of our time talking about the issue of healthcare reform. And that is the fourth article we've posted. And we just mentioned a minute ago the second article we posted, which was the one by Ken Timmerman. One other that I thought I'd mention just in passing, we may get to a little bit later if we have some time. This one is the first article by Andrew McCarthy, How Sharia Supremacism and Judicial Imperialism Threaten National Security. And the problem that he has is twofold. One was what we just mentioned, and that is this sort of inability for people to admit that when we talk about radical Islam, we are talking about Muslims. We're talking about Islamic thought. Now, it may be very different than the Muslim thought or theology of your next door neighbor who is a Muslim, but nevertheless, there oftentimes are individuals that have a difficult time really explaining what that really means in terms of the virulent theology and philosophy. Then the second part of his title, Judicial Imperialism, he's talking about the fact that the Fourth Circuit Court is one that may be even more liberal, perhaps the most liberal court, now even more liberal than the Ninth Circuit Court. And we had a conversation about this Friday with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, in which what they chose to do is not look at the law itself, which gives authority to the President of the United States to determine who can or cannot come into this country, but instead chose to select off some of the things that candidate Donald Trump said, which frankly he shouldn't have said, but that's another story for another day, that were used to say, well, then there's animus in the midst of this executive order. And this is what problem you have when you start trying to judge a person's motives. Sometimes people with very good motives write really bad laws. And some people with really bad motives write really good laws. Sometimes people with really bad motives oftentimes come up with an executive order that really makes a lot of sense. And sometimes people with really good motives come up with executive orders that are a disaster. So getting into motives is, first of all, not helpful. It's not accurate. And most importantly, it's not what the Constitution allows. We actually have Supreme Court decisions that have come down saying you cannot use something that a candidate said in an election to justify or to actually invalidate something that now elected individual did while he or she is in office. Just again, think about some of the things that candidate Donald Trump said, or let's go back 8 years and talk about candidate Barack Obama said. And in this case, we'll be talking about that in the second hour about health care. Those simply cannot be used. And so, again, he, I think, makes a really good case. And so that's the first article we wanted to address there as well. But one of the things Ken Timmerman and I were talking about just a minute ago is this speech by Donald Trump. And this week, I have got a commentary coming out that I've already written that addresses some of that, because before it's completely forgotten and we get in the midst of the day-to-day back and forth, what Donald Trump tweeted or what was said by ABC News or NBC News or what a particular individual is being investigated. This was, I think, a much more significant speech than sometimes some people really understand, if for no other reason than here when he is standing in front of more than 50 Muslim leaders or other individuals involved in their countries. He mentions the word terror or terrorism 30 times. That alone was a contrast to previous administrations. As I mentioned, established this global center for combating extremist ideology. Because in the speech, he's really saying, in some respects, this is your problem, not ours. Obviously, we have a stake in this. But these threats that you face, for example, he's actually speaking in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, you face a very significant threat. The Islamic world and the Islamic State, or ISIS, would like to destroy you. As a matter of fact, they'd like to destroy Mecca. They would like to end your tourist business. They would like to completely execute those of you in the room. So you have a real stake in some of this. And so he talks about how his vision is that young Muslim boys and girls should be able to grow up free from fear, safe from violence, and innocent of hatred, that young Muslim men and women should have the chance to build a new era of prosperity for themselves and their people. And as I pointed out just a few minutes ago when we were talking with Ken Timmerman, if you've listened to this program any length of period of time, you know that one of the things I say so often is the greatest threat to a Muslim oftentimes is another Muslim. And Donald Trump in that speech quoted one statistic that said, again, about 95% of the victims of terrorism are themselves Muslim. Now, that certainly was not the case 2 weeks ago at the Ariana Grande concert, but it is pretty much what is happening in many places around the world. And then focusing his time and attention on Iran, where we've had sort of back-channel communications wanting to have some kind of nuclear deal with Iran, how dangerous that was, just reminding us that Iran funds, arms, and trains terrorists, militias, and other extremist groups. I thought was just another very significant statement that he made. And so again, that will be coming out in a commentary this week. And if you haven't already signed up to receive my Viewpoints commentaries, we send them to you in your inbox Monday through Friday. And then, of course, we air Penna Dexter's commentary. She does a weekly commentary for other radio stations, including for this network as well, and for these programs. And so we would send that one to your inbox on Saturday. So let me encourage you, if you have not signed up, to get the Viewpoints commentaries. It's a great way to keep in contact with us. Well, the other point I wanted to make is that there are, I think, a lot of people in America right now that are convinced on terrorism. And the reason I bring that up is because recently we had, just a few months ago, Joel Rosenberg in studio. Next month, by the way, I'm going to be teaching with him at Word of Life, and we're going to see what we can do to maybe even pull together another trip to Israel and tie it into his epicenter conference that will take place. But anyway, when Joel Rosenberg was in studio with us, he pointed out that there was a survey that he commissioned, and he asked the McLaughlin and Association survey about 1,000 likely voters on their view about our war with the Islamic State, or ISIS. And he found that only 1 in 3 Americans believe, quote, the U.S. and our allies are winning the war against the Islamic State. So less than a third, really. And a remarkable 41% believe the U.S. and the allies are losing the war against the Islamic State. So we're in a situation right now where we recognize that we need to do some other things. And this has been, I think, a remarkable change in administrations. The previous administration recognized the danger, although let's recognize the president one time referred to ISIS or the Islamic State as a JV squad. But there was always sort of this idea of containment, and that is we can contain them. But here you have something remarkably different in the speech given by President Donald Trump, and that is the idea of going and actually rooting them out. And really, in many cases, even calling for them, the Muslims in that particular room, to root them out of your places of worship, to remove them out of your communities, out of your land, and then to not only deny them territory and populations, but also to strip them of any kind of access to financial channels. And so I think there are some remarkable changes that have been taking place. And so if nothing else, it is a reminder that maybe there is a very different kind of view about the Islamic State and ISIS, and recognize that when we had Joel Rosenberg in studio, one of the things he pointed out is since 2014, and these numbers probably have changed just in the last couple of months since he's been on, or last month or so, but at that time he was able to show us that there were 117 people that have been arrested in this country, in the United States, for connection to ISIS terrorist plots. And of course, we saw what happened in Manchester, England, as just a reminder of some of that danger. So let's take a break. When we come back, I'd love to get your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. Also want to address another issue that came from Andrew McCarthy. And I mentioned, of course, his piece on Sharia supremacism and judicial imperialism, but he also has written a piece that talks about how, in many cases, in an attempt to address this issue of terrorism, we've had illegal surveillance of the American people. So we'll get into that. But if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read some of these articles, we've posted 4 of them today. Some of them related to ISIS and the issue of terrorism. Some related to our conversation in the next hour on healthcare. We'll take a break, take some phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Well, the numbers are out, and they don't look good. According to the Pew Research Center, for the first time in 3 years, worldwide hostility to religion increased in the year 2015. Between 2014 and 2015, those countries marked with high or very high levels of government restrictions, actual government policies and activity restricting the free exercise of religion of its people, grew a full percentage point. During that same period, social hostilities increased 4%. Social hostilities are acts of religious hostility by private individuals, organizations, or groups in society. So even if the government was not hostile in terms of official policy, the private actions of its people grew significantly. Looking at the big picture, whether it's government policies or private individuals, 40% of the countries across the globe are hostile to religion. That means that the world is inching closer to a majority of countries demonstrating hostility towards religion. Of course, we can be immediately thankful for the great many protections we possess as Americans, but let us not be lulled into thinking that our experiment in liberty is the historical norm. Religious freedom is not something passed on from one generation to another by virtue of our DNA. It requires every generation to renew its commitment to liberty, and especially religious liberty, both here and abroad. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Second hour, we'll spend some time talking about healthcare policy, but let me pick up just a few other issues here. One of the other articles we want to post has to do with this issue of illegal surveillance, and this is of concern for many of us. For those of you that have been listening to Point of View, might even remember back even during the Clinton administration, but especially during the Bush administration, there were people calling in saying, I don't want the government listening to my phone calls. I don't want the government looking at my emails. And we would always assure people, no, that's not happening. They don't really care what you sent to your Aunt Sally. They don't really care about what you actually wrote in an email to somebody that was a friend of the family. But we certainly now are starting to see something of real concern. And Andrew McCarthy, who I've mentioned before in this hour, is an individual that was a federal prosecutor. As a matter of fact, he is the one that actually prosecuted the blind sheikh in the first World Trade Center bombing. And so has really been, over the years, an expert on Islam, and we certainly depend upon him for that. But also because of his legal background, he starts this piece by saying that during the Obama years, the National Security Agency intentionally and routinely intercepted and reviewed communications of American citizens in violation of the Constitution and of court-ordered guidelines implemented pursuant to federal law. Now, this is a pretty outstanding claim, but it's backed up, first of all, by an opinion that came from the FISA court, and that is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's what FISA stands for, and this is the court that determines whether or not we can listen in to your conversations, whether we can tap into your emails. And so it comes, first of all, from an opinion that comes from the FISA court, and then from investigative work that's been done for some time now by people like John Solomon and Sarah Carter and others. And there are really kind of two problems, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds. One of the reasons why I don't think this is going to be the kind of scandal that it deserves to be is because sometimes it gets a little complicated, and as soon as it gets complicated, sometimes our eyes glaze over and go, well, I don't know. But let's take the first one. The first problem is a smaller problem, and it's what's called the incidental collection of data. In other words, if I am trying to determine whether this particular individual is a criminal or a terrorist, they might be a terrorist suspect, they may be a criminal investigator, there may be a way that incidentally I tap into some of that. Or even if I want to see, as we've been talking about now, is there been a collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians? Then I would have incidental kind of collection of data that was not because I wanted to know what somebody in the Trump administration or Trump campaign said, but what I want to know is what the Russians said, what the terrorists said, what the criminals said, whatever it might be, what the Iranian might say. That's a smaller piece. The bigger piece is this, and that is what's called the upstream collection of information. Now, stay with me for just a second, because it is really not possible to collect just one email. If I wanted to collect an email from this particular terrorist, that's really not that easy to do. So what the NSA, the National Security Agency, will do is it collects a package of emails, and then it will begin to search through those. Well, guess what? Your emails are in that package. Your phone calls are in that package. Your communications are in that package. And so those are being collected without a warrant or even probable cause. Now, we have a constitution, it's called the Fourth Amendment in particular, that prevents you from having individuals collect and do searches on your information or coming to your house without a search warrant, and on and on and on. And so, again, you might say, well, that's not much of a problem because, you know what, I'm not calling terrorists, I'm not calling Iranian officials. I'm not calling criminals, as far as I know. But that's not the problem, because it turns out that they will analyze those emails, those other means of communication, not just if they were to or from the target, but if there was anything you said about the target. In other words, if you had an email and just said Osama bin Laden, I can't believe they finally killed Osama bin Laden, that's going to pull that up. Or I can't believe that we had this happen in Manchester, England with this terrorist. It would pull those kinds of things up very quickly. And it's kind of back to the point I've made just a few minutes ago, and that is we spent a fair amount of time about a decade ago really telling you as listeners that we should not be concerned about intelligence agencies collecting and listening in on your phone calls or reading your emails, because after all, they were looking for terrorists, they were looking for criminals, they were looking for actionable intelligence. And at least it appears, in light of what we know right now, that some of that indeed took place during the Obama administration, and we'll probably hear more about that in the future. Just before I take a break, I thought I'd pick up one other point, and that is we've had a couple of these elections. We had a special election in Montana, and you are familiar with that story. We've got a special election coming up here in Georgia, and you may know the story up there in Montana where you had Greg Gianforte. He won the election, but interestingly enough, this happened after he body slammed the staff writer, Ben Jacobs, with The Guardian. And interestingly enough, you had a lot of voters at the time said they wanted their ballots back after this episode so they could change their vote. Well, too bad. You voted early before this late-breaking story, and it's quite possible that he was elected in large part because this happened after so many people had voted early. And I think this kind of brings us back to something we've talked about on this program before, especially when we've had John Fund on the program. John Fund has written books like Stealing Elections and others, in which we recognize that we're making it easier and easier for people to vote early. And as a matter of fact, some states are really beginning to go overboard on that. We reported last fall, you might remember, that in North Carolina, it was possible that you could vote for who you would select as your president more than 2 weeks before the first presidential debate. So here we see, again, one of the problems with early voting. Sometimes what happens in those 11th hours, the last week, you learn some things about a candidate, but you know what? You can't get your ballot back. In addition to that, of course, we've talked with John Fund about some other problems with early voting, and that is early voting and some of these very loose absentee laws make voter fraud much easier. And he said that because we love this kind of no-excuse absentee voting, it makes it much easier to commit fraud because oftentimes this voting is not done with the oversight and supervision of election officials. And I have this one quote from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that concluded the lack of in-person at-the-polls accountability makes absentee ballots the tool of choice for those inclined to commit fraud. So nevertheless, what happened up in Montana, I hope that might be a wake-up call to rethink early voting. It is quite possible that if indeed people knew a little bit more about that body slam before they cast a vote, maybe he wouldn't have been elected to Congress. We have another election coming up in Georgia, and if nothing else, just a reminder that early voting, although we love the convenience of it, it certainly allows for the possibility of mischief in terms of voter fraud, and certainly is also a real concern if indeed there are late-breaking stories that you did not have a chance to know about. But we're going to take a break, and we're going to have in studio with us for the next hour Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll get into a couple of issues. He's written today about trade. He's also, of course, written about the Paris issue that relates to the Paris Agreement on climate change. But most of the time, we're going to spend our time talking about some of the healthcare issues. He always is somebody we depend upon to help us understand a little bit more about the Affordable Care Act and the American Health Care Act. And so we're going to have him in studio and give you a chance to hear his comments and ask your questions. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the articles that we've been quoting from today, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with Dr. Merrill Matthews right after these important messages.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Merrill Matthews, as his PhD, resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. So many times, if you open up Forbes or Wall Street Journal, or of course the various IPI brochures and other articles, you will see all sorts of things that he has written about in terms of healthcare. And so we're going to get in that in just a minute. But Dr. Merrill Matthews as well, you brought in quite a bit today. We can talk about the Paris climate deal as well as German trades. Let's spend a little bit of time on that briefly, because Donald Trump goes to Europe, and in that particular case decides that we're not going to get as involved in the Paris Accords and all that the Europeans have decided to do so. He was the odd man out, but I think it was a very good decision. And you said the Senate must have a role in this Paris climate deal. So tell us more.
He was the odd man out in a number of things. Good to be with you again, Kirby. Yes, the news coming back is that he will probably exit the Paris Climate Agreement.
Right.
That upset a number of the European Union nations,
sure. Yeah.
In part because they intended the U.S. to be throwing a lot of money in this, and now if they stay in and the U.S. drops out, then that doesn't change the goals. They're supposed to be trying by 2020. They're supposed to essentially have gotten pulled together between the U.S., EU, and private sector companies, roughly $100 billion a year that they're supposed to be handing out to a lot of smaller countries to help affect with the purported effects of climate change. And I would argue one of the reasons a lot of these countries are in this is because they're going to be on the receiving end of all this money. So Donald Trump has implied he may be pulling out. I suggested that this should always have been considered a treaty and sent to the Senate for ratification, as the Constitution requires. Barack Obama, if he had had the votes in the Senate, he surely would have sent it to the Senate for ratification. He didn't have it. They tried to adjust some of the elements of the Paris Treaty to try to say, no, this doesn't have to be ratified, at least these parts of it. But I think Donald Trump should just not have to carry the burden of this himself. Send it to the treaty, send the treaty to the Senate now, and let them vote on it. See if the Senate approves it.
I know they won't, because they'd have to come up with a lot more than just 50 votes.
I know they won't too, but from a political standpoint, that would actually give him a little bit of wiggle room, because if the Senate says no, then his ability to come to the states, to the other countries, and say we're not in this because the Senate would not constitutionally ratify this.
Yes, well, we have a lot of these UN treaties that are just sort of hanging out there because they've never been ratified.
Right.
And if you ever got a really liberal, progressive Senate, maybe they would. But you also make the case that not only is this something that would have to be ratified by the Senate, but it really isn't fair to the American people, and it certainly is a redistribution scheme, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Barack Obama went ahead and gave a contribution to the UN Climate Fund, $500 million twice, one as he was closing the door behind him on the way out. But yes, he had essentially pledged $3 billion. He would have certainly pledged more if he could have gotten congressional approval for it, but he didn't. But I would argue he didn't have authority to spend that money anyway. So Congress approves federal spending, and Barack Obama is handing out this money, I would argue, self-approved as and self-ratified from himself.
Well, let's take one other one, then we'll spend some time, obviously, the rest of the time talking about health care. And that is when the president was with Angela Merkel. It was kind of interesting because, first of all, he was complaining about they're not spending enough on defense and they're not really supporting NATO and all the rest. But he also, over the last couple of days, has been saying that the Germans on trade are bad, very bad. I guess that's a typical Donald Trump phraseology. But you'd help us understand that really, just because you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit, you got to think a little more deeply about those issues, don't you?
Right. Yeah. Economists are not really worried about trade surpluses and trade deficits because we have a trade deficit with Germany. We have a trade deficit in general. Donald Trump used to stress an $800 billion trade deficit. Actually, when you add in services, because we import more services than we export more services than we buy, it comes down to about $500 billion. But wealthy countries oftentimes do have trade surpluses. When we are doing better economically, we actually have a bigger trade surplus. But that money is balanced by the money that comes back from countries that they spend in investing, because they get the dollars, they need to do something with the dollars. They can't necessarily use them in their country, so they use that money and it comes back to the U.S. So the trade, what's called the current account, is the trade deficit or surplus. We're usually in a trade deficit. But the capital account, which is money coming back in the U.S., will generally always essentially will mirror the trade's deficit. So it balances out.
Yes. Well, and again, it's worth pointing out that we have a trade surplus with a number of countries. You talk about this in your latest article that just has come out. And the other issue is, if you're really concerned about trade deficits, there's a way to turn that around, and it's called lowering the corporate income tax. Wouldn't that be a very significant thing to do?
What was funny about Trump's concern about Germany is them having a trade surplus. He feels like trade surpluses and deficits are like profits and losses. And so if you're making profits, you're doing good. If you have trade surpluses, you're doing good. But economists just don't see it that way. And so as a result, he sort of doesn't understand this. But even if you thought that, Germany has a trade surplus with the U.S. because they're making products Americans want and they want to buy. And Germany takes that money that we spend there and they come back and build factories here.
Right.
But it's a competitive market, and if you want to make American products more competitive in relation to the rest of the world, you lower corporate income taxes, which Trump wants to do, and you lower regulations, and you allow us to be able to produce those products less expensively, which makes us more competitive.
You know, remember when we used to have the gross national product, now they call it gross domestic product, in part because they just said we can't keep track of all the various connections and all the foreign countries that invest in here and all the rest. So they made some of those changes simply because it's a much more complex economic set of circumstances we find ourselves in the 21st century.
It is a very complex set. And I think Donald Trump, has a good understanding of some economics. With trade, I don't think that's his strong suit.
Yes. Well, let's take a break. And when we come back, one of the articles we've posted here, I love your opening line. Having spent 25 years working on and writing about healthcare policies, there's one thing I can say without fear of contradiction. Health policy is confusing. So we're going to try to have you help us unconfuse some of this.
And no one's more confused than the Democrats.
It's going to be nuts. But again, we're going to talk about two things, and we'll try to explain these as we go along. The Affordable Care Act, we'll just refer to that oftentimes as Obamacare. That was passed in 2010. That's the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And then you have the American Health Care Act, which has passed the House and is now sitting, and I do want to emphasize the word sitting in the Senate. Not a lot seems to be happening right there, right?
Not much right now.
Not at the moment. And so that we could call repeal and replace. But we're going to talk about what does this mean? Some that are convinced that we'll put a lot more people in a very difficult situation that have pre-existing conditions. We also, of course, have the CBO says a lot more people will be uninsured. So we're going to try to sort some of this out. And if you'd like to join our conversation, we'll certainly entertain those phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio. We'll come back and talk about healthcare policy right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Was an ABC sitcom canceled due to Hollywood politics? Some viewers think so and started an online petition calling for a boycott of ABC. 2 weeks ago, ABC News announced that they were cutting Tim Allen's show, The Last Man Standing. He responded with a short Twitter announcement that said, "Stunned and blindsided by the network I called home for the last 6 years." Some viewers point to the show's cancellation as a clear victim of an attack on conservatives. On the surface, it would seem that the family comedy about a man who has strong conservative opinions about politics and culture got the axe because of his views. The show has been the mainstay of ABC's Friday schedule. It has an average of about 6 million viewers. That is more than ABC shows Blackish and Shark Tank, more than the ABC show The Goldbergs, which just scored a 2-year renewal for a 5th and 6th season. It's also worth mentioning that The Last Man Standing has also done very well in syndication. The network contends that money was the issue. Each year, apparently, there was wrangling over the license fee for the program between ABC and 20th Century Fox TV. Also, the fee is higher than for other programs because of the salary that Tim Allen receives for the show. Money might be the reason, or money might be the excuse. I don't really know, but it does remind me of the comments we heard from department stores that dropped the Ivanka Trump line of fashions. Was it the lack of profitability of her fashion line, or was it the fact that executives of the stores hated her father? It's hard to tell. Some speculate that the show might move to Fox TV since 20th Century Fox TV already owns the show. It might also end up on Hallmark or Netflix. That might be a better fit for a show that makes conservative comments that don't go over so well with Hollywood executives. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in studio with us today Dr. Merrill Matthews. We're going to get into a variety of different aspects of course, the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes referred to as Obamacare, and the American Health Care Act, which oftentimes is referred to as Repeal and Replace, and that has passed the House and is sitting at the Senate. One of the diagrams that we've shown before, Dr. Matthews, are the number of states. I'll just hold this up for people to see. 24 different states had their premiums double, and a lot of them are states in which we're broadcasting. And then we have a number of states, and we broadcast in all three of these states, Alabama, Alaska, and Oklahoma, that had their premiums tripled in just 4 years. And more to come. Haven't you looked? I think you've been looking at these numbers now. They're predicting that there's going to be a lot more sticker shock for everybody.
A lot more sticker shock. You know, in January 2013, I and Mark Liddell, a retired actuary, ran a piece in the Wall Street Journal talking about the sticker shock. That was the term they used in it. Yes. And we talked about 50%, perhaps 100%, and depending upon the state that you lived. And that got Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, coming out saying, not a chance that's going to happen. So we were doing that a year before the actual insurance provision kicked in. Turns out we were on the low side.
You were on the low side. Isn't that something?
But, you know, we always explained in there that this is going to create what's called a death spiral in health insurance, where premiums go up, young, healthy people drop out because they don't feel like they should spend that much money. The pool gets smaller and sicker. Premiums go up even higher. The next level of people drop out. The people who are the sickest are going to stay in, because even if you have cancer and you're spending $10,000-$15,000 a month, even $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a month premium looks good by comparison. So they stay in the pool, and as a result, the pool gets smaller and sicker, and that's what we call the death spiral. And insurers end up dropping out of this and collapsing the whole system.
Well, again, the death spiral is one, and what that happens to individuals is get smaller and smaller and sicker and sicker. You mentioned something in passing. Let me come back to this, because off air ask you, and I don't think you on air you can give me any better answer. How many states now only have one insurer? Because it seems like the last person out of some of these states turn off the lights. We are getting to a point where there aren't many options left.
There were several groups that were trying to track this over time, but so many insurers are abandoning so quickly, we can't keep track of it.
Isn't that something?
Just in May, you had Iowa make an announcement in there. You had Virginia and some other states. A Blue Cross in North Carolina, I believe it was, decided to pull out. Molina, which was a major health insurer based in California, just a couple of years ago, the CEO of Molina said, "We're doing great here," and Democrats and the media said, "Well, just do it like Molina's do it." This month in May, the board fired the CEO of Molina because they're losing so much money.
So, I mean, you're going to laugh because it's just so painful, and I don't mean to make light of this, but it's so bad. And then when you have individuals sometimes in Congress saying, "Well, we're not going to change this law because it's working so well," I'm going, what facts do you have that we don't have?
And just remember, Congress created an out for them.
Yes.
They were supposed to be according to the law in Obamacare. But then after they passed the legislation and lo and behold found out they were in it themselves, they went to the Office of Personnel Management, I believe it's OPM or Management and Budget, I can't remember which one. And the head of the organization said, "Well, and Obama encouraged him, let me go looking." Son of a gun. I found out that there's a way that we can be exempt from this, and we can get our premiums paid for and be in the FEA, the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program, like they had been all along.
Sure.
So they created an out for them. And then now they're not sure why all this is happening out there, because it's working fine for them.
Working fine for them. And I remember when that just was passed, we had Representative Michael Burgess sitting in that very chair there saying, "Well, no, I'm in it too." And then shortly thereafter, he never said it again because he was out of it. And again, that's another issue. I'd love to hear from our callers. Does it make sense to have members of Congress put you in a healthcare system that they themselves will not put themselves into? It seems to me that they should be under the same laws and the same kind of regulations as everyone else. So that's been kind of a big issue.
You would think. In fact, that was added as an amendment to Obamacare to make Congress be under those laws. And then as soon as it passed, they looked for an exemption to get themselves out.
We have quite a number of calls coming in. We'll get to those in just a minute. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this issue of pre-existing conditions. The Center for American Progress, of course, they want to stay with the Obamacare, or what's called the Affordable Care Act. And so they have this list of individuals, and they say that if indeed you end up with what the House passed, which is called the American Health Care Act, then you're going to have this invisible risk sharing program, which is supposed to have, $15 billion in that. And so there's a big issue right now about pre-existing conditions. But the other article we've posted is by you, pointing out that, wait a minute, 50 million seniors who receive coverage from Medicare, they don't have to deal with pre-existing conditions. Another 70 million individuals that are low income in Medicaid, they don't have to deal with pre-existing conditions. So I'm not minimizing it, but it's a smaller group than you would believe if you just listen to the mainstream media.
And 155 million Americans who work for employers who provide health insurance and their dependents. It's not completely what we call a guaranteed issue provision, but if you're going to work for an employer, they may put a small waiting period on you, but you will get health insurance coverage from the employer, and it will eventually cover all of your conditions. So as a result, roughly 275, maybe 280 million Americans out of a total of about 325, I think it is, million Americans are essentially exempted from any pre-existing condition. You've got prior to Obamacare, you had 16 million Americans, including my wife, in the individual market. They were able to get a health insurance policy, even though most states could decline it because of a pre-existing condition. So the Government Accountability Office estimated that roughly 3, maybe 4 million Americans would be affected by the pre-existing condition issue. And the Republicans have a safety net for them to capture them in case that's the case. Most states did as well, even prior to Obamacare. So even though it was an issue for some people, it's a relatively small percentage of the public, and there needs to be a good safety net. And I would argue that pre-Obamacare, that safety net could have been improved, but there's a safety net in there in the Republican plan.
And isn't it possible, some people even talked about having two-tiered system, and that is if you don't need pre-existing conditions, that's insurance, because insurance is when I buy my car or my house, I don't get it after my car has an accident, after my house burns down. So we treat that differently than somebody who has a pre-existing condition. And even in pre-existing conditions, what you sometimes think, Dr. Matthews, are the individual, maybe a child born with spina bifida or cystic fibrosis or something like that. And that is certainly something that you would want to cover. But then you have some individuals say, I'm not going to buy insurance until I get sick, and then I'm going to buy insurance. I would put that almost in a different category, wouldn't you?
It would, but under law, before Obamacare, if you had a child, once a child was born to a family, they had 30 days to put the child on their policy, regardless of any pre-existing condition. So a child could have been born with spina bifida. They would have been able to get on that parent's policy with no pre-existing condition in the individual market. So there were provisions out there to handle these. Democrats completely ignored these as they were trying to sort of drum up this notion that this was a major problem that affected so many millions that we had to do something about it, because all the problems we're facing right now was the Democrats saying we've got to try to fix this pre-existing condition, therefore restructure the whole health insurance marketplace.
Well, let's take some phone calls. We'll continue taking calls throughout the entire hour here. We'll go to Ohio first. Diane, you're on with Dr. Merrill Matthews.
Hello. I'm curious, in the bill that passed Congress, whether the penalty has been removed for those who just aren't able to participate at all.
Yes, the penalty has been removed for those who are not able to participate. However, if you come back in the system, then you'll have to pay a penalty. So if you're uninsured and you're not getting health insurance, there is no penalty as there is under Obamacare. But if you want to come back, if you've been uninsured for 63 days or more under the Republican plan over the last year, they will charge you 30% more for 1 year. And if you had a medical condition, you could be forced to pay a higher premium, but that's when the safety net comes in. So, yes, there is a penalty, but if you come back in, but not if you just remain uninsured.
And when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about that, because that's to prevent the problem of jumping out and jumping into the system. We saw this with Romney Care up there in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We've seen this with Obamacare. And so that was an attempt to maybe separate out those two different groups of individuals we were mentioning. But we need to get into that in a little more detail, and we have to take a mandatory break. But that opens up a line if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk a little bit more about where that particular American Health Care Act stands in the United States Senate, what it would mean to you. And when we hear about individuals that would, quote, lose their coverage, some of them, it's not they lose it, they don't want it, you know. And so we'll get into that issue as well. So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do so with Dr. Merrill Matthews right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about healthcare policy. In studio with us, Dr. Merrill Matthews, an individual that has certainly done quite a bit to write on these issues and investigate these issues. So if you have a comment or question, we certainly welcome your phone call, 1-800-351-1212. Diane asked about this idea of a penalty. Let's come back and explain this. If it passes the Senate, right now it's passed the House, so if it passes the Senate, signed by the president, there would no longer be a penalty, but the mandate still stays in there.
Yeah, as I understand it, the mandate is still in there, and they couldn't remove the mandate, they felt, because of the process, the reconciliation process that we're going through. We've talked a little bit about that. So they're going through something of a strange process in order to be able to avoid a filibuster in the Senate. So they leave the mandate in, but they essentially get rid of the penalty. And so, from a Christian standpoint, the law says I do this, but I'm not being penalized. So my guess is a lot of Christians will say, I'm good with not having to pay the penalty and just go on.
Speaking of Christians, that gets into something else, and that is the CBO a number of months ago said there would be 24 million people that would be left without insurance. Then they went back and changed it and brought it down to 23 million. But a lot of the people that are listed as uninsured could be like a lot of our listeners, including you, your wife, and even myself, that are part of MediShare. That's not considered insurance, but you are covered, aren't you?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the sort of fastest growing element in health insurance, even though it's not insurance, is the Christian sharing ministries, because there was a provision in the Obamacare legislation which says if you join one of these ministries, they've had to have been in place, I think, by 1999, so that you couldn't just have a bunch of companies come in.
Right.
But then you're exempt from the mandate. So a lot of people went in there because of that, and then because so many insurance policies are collapsing and people don't have any other options, they're moving to the Christian sharing ministries just because that's the only thing that may be available to a lot of Christians out there.
I might just mention that would be MediShare, which has, last time I looked, about 160,000 individuals. Samaritan Ministries, which has about 221,000 individuals. And then Christian Healthcare Ministries, which has another 100,000, and those were numbers that are a couple of months old, but it's just an illustration that when you say, well, you don't have insurance, well, actually, some people have something that's like insurance that's actually Christian. So that's an issue there as well. And then when we say that people will lose their insurance, sometimes people are saying, I don't want that. I would be glad to have a high deductible policy that I could still protect me when I maybe have cancer or a huge accident, but I'd rather self-insure the day-to-day kinds of medical expenses that I might have.
Or they may want just a non-qualified type of coverage. The Congressional Budget Office, which came out with that score and the number of people, has conceded that it was not counting the people who were who might have some type of insurance that was not qualified. In other words, of that 24 million, there may be a number of those people with something that is not qualified. Could be a Christian sharing ministry, but could also be what we call a mini-med. And it's not clear to me, but my wife had a great Blue Cross policy in Texas prior to Obamacare, but it had to change because it wasn't Obamacare qualified. And I think all it was primarily the preventive medicine, preventive care that had to be paid for free, and a few things like that. We'd be happy to go back to that.
Yes.
It was a good policy that was comprehensive, and she could see most doctors she wanted to. But those were gone because of Obamacare. So there would be a lot of people, I think, who would have coverage. It's just not what Washington wanted them to have.
Let's get back to this issue of pre-existing conditions, because that's a big issue. And we'll go to the state of Maine. And Catherine, thank you for calling today.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. Yes, I have a pre-existing condition I've had all my life.
Uh-huh.
And I'm presently on Maine Care and Medicaid, and I'm up there in age, 78, and so I live alone. So what does that how is it going to affect me?
Absolutely zero impact on you. You're qualified for Medicare if you're 78, and the vast majority of seniors are. And then Medicaid comes in and covers the cost of Medicare recipients when they're lower income, so it covers their out-of-pocket expenses. That everybody over 65, this has no impact on you whatsoever. You're still under Medicare and Medicaid.
And so again, that's something now there again under the American Health Care Act. It gives a little more flexibility to some of the states now
on Medicaid.
Yeah, on Medicaid.
That's
Talk about that for just a minute, because that's, I think, a very significant change that might make a difference.
Right. They want to block grant the money to the states and give the states a certain amount of permission to work within that to figure out how they want to create a Medicaid system, because Medicaid is one of the most corrupt isn't. fraud-ridden programs out there.
Right.
So they're looking for ways to do it, and states will probably experiment. But under current law, Medicaid steps in to cover the cost of low-income seniors, and any out-of-pocket costs they have, or most out-of-pocket costs. And I would be surprised if that changes much.
You know, I think, again, Medicaid is very different than, say, Portland, Maine, than it is in Detroit, Michigan, and very different than it would be in Stockton, California, and very different than it would be in Tupelo, Mississippi. So in some respects, having some of that flexibility might be very helpful, don't you think?
I think so. And I would be, for a state like Maine, I would be surprised if they changed much with respect to low-income people, just because that's the politics of Maine.
Well, let's take another phone call. We'll head to South Carolina this time. Matthew, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, thanks. We really appreciate and very informative. My question is, how can President Obama get $500 million without the approval of, I thought the House of Representatives held the purse. What's going on?
So that gets us back to the one on the Paris agreement. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Good question, Matthew. That was, the administration has certain prerogatives in its budget to be able to funnel various monies in some places, sometimes by shuffling money around in various ways. And so he pulled up $500 million twice and handed it over to the Paris Climate Agreement. When Donald Trump came in, there was some a push to try to get him to try to rescind that check if he could, but it had already gone out the door. And I think the UN, which received the money, probably stamped it and deposited it in a hurry so that they couldn't call it back somehow. But they do have certain flexibilities. I would argue under a responsible constitutional president, anything like that should be submitted to the Congress. But that was not what I would call the Trump. It may not be the Trump administration, but it certainly wasn't the Obama administration.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, appreciate your phone call.
You know, under the Obama administration, HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, has a lot of money. And Congress came up and said, we're not going to allow you to spend, this certain amount of money on this. So HHS says, fine, we'll just go shuffle our budgets around and pull money from other places that you have approved, and we'll spend it on it anyway. So those kinds of things went on in the administration. I suspect there was money going on that we didn't know about either.
I would think so. Just before we take a break, let's talk about the amount of discretion that now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, has. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the previous one, under Kathleen Sebelius. You and I both, you probably read it more than I have, but I took the time to kind of make my way through the Affordable Care Act, and I was struck, Dr. Matthews, the number of times it said the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine, shall decide. And it seems to me that under a pro-abortion Kathleen Sebelius, you got things like the contraceptive mandate and things like that. Now you have a pro-life Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price. It seems to me that right now the Secretary has a lot of discretion.
A lot of discretion. I wrote about it at the time. I think, if I remember right, there was roughly nearly 3,000 mentions of the term Secretary in the Affordable Care Act.
I had no interest in it.
And the vast majority of those were related to HHS, the Secretary of HHS. As you said, is the Secretary shall decide, she shall promulgate, she will do this. Democrats gave the Secretary of HHS HHS a lot of power under this legislation, a lot of discretion. Kathleen Sebelius moved it in one direction. Tom Price wants to move it back. I'm told behind the scenes that he keeps trying to do certain things, and then the lawyers at HHS keep saying your hands are shackled a little bit. You need to get the law changed under the repeal and replace in order to have a little bit more freedom to do what you want. But I suspect we'll see him doing a number of things, and that's actually meant to be phase 2 of the healthcare reform process. So repeal and replace was meant to be phase 1. HHS Secretary clawing back a lot of these regulations meant to be phase 2. And phase 3 was meant to be things like malpractice reform and health insurance across state lines and other things that they wanted to do.
We'll talk about some of that because, again, you said that it might help a little bit to have the ability to buy insurance across state lines, but not as much as people say. But, again, competition would be helpful, especially in all these states where you have one insurer.
Or none.
Or none. So we'll take a break. We also have some more phone calls, so we'll give some of you a chance to ask questions or make some comments. We are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Merrill Matthews, and have posted a couple of things that you can read by him, and that will take you to IPI. And by the way, we do have a link to the Institute for Policy Innovation. Follow those links, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Well, the numbers are out, and they don't look good. According to the Pew Research Center, for the first time in 3 years, worldwide hostility to religion increased in the year 2015. Between 2014 and 2015, those countries marked with high or very high levels of government restrictions, actual government policies and activity restricting the free exercise of religion of its people, grew a full percentage point. During that same period, social hostilities increased 4%. Social hostilities are acts of religious hostility by private individuals, organizations, or groups in society. So even if the government was not hostile in terms of official policy, the private actions of its people grew significantly. Looking at the big picture, whether it's government policies or private individuals, 40% of the countries across the globe are hostile to religion. That means that the world is inching closer to a majority of countries demonstrating hostility towards religion. Of course, we can be immediately thankful for the great many protections we possess as Americans, but let us not be lulled into thinking that our experiment in liberty is the historical norm. Religious freedom is not something passed on from one generation to another by virtue of our DNA. It requires every generation to renew its commitment to liberty, and especially religious liberty, both here and abroad. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Before I forget, let me just mention we have a link to IPI, which is the Institute for Policy Innovation. And I might just mention that we have a couple of articles that are also there. We are, of course, published one by Dr. Merrill Matthews that dealt with the issue of the Paris Agreement, but there is also one there on German trade, one on selective transparency, one on the Ford CEO and the casualty, Obama's green dreams, and many, many more. So let me encourage you to go to ipi.org, and you'll find that very helpful. Let's get back to the phones, though. And first of all, Bill in Florida. I think you want to talk about the cost of health care. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, good afternoon, gentlemen. I've heard over the years a lot of conversations, including on your program, and it just seems like the cost of health care is masked by health insurance, and nobody what anything actually costs anymore. And I'm wondering, isn't that really the problem?
Bill, you know more about health insurance than the vast majority of members of Congress with that statement. Can we get you up to Washington? Bill's got it absolutely right. Because when the vast majority of cases, when you and I go to the doctor, go to the hospital, go to the pharmacy, somebody else is paying the bill, right. Consumers don't act like consumers as we do in every other sector of the economy. So we tend to say, give that to me, give that to me. We're just not concerned about the price for it the same way that we have been in other sectors of the economy. So one of the things that we had talked about over the years was higher deductible policies, health savings accounts, to try to, at least on the smaller expenditures, we would have a reason to say, doctor, where do I get value for my health care dollar? How much is this going to cost? Can I have a generic as opposed to a brand name prescription and things of that nature? Now, as it turns out, Democrats didn't intend this, but because they've so messed up the health insurance market, the deductibles now are much higher than I would have ever suggested as a high deductible proponent.
You used to get pilloried for some of that.
They would hammer me for being in the pockets of the insurance company because I said, well, maybe a $2,000, $2,500 deductible policy. Now they're $6,000 and $7,000, and Democrats still claim that's good. But the irony here is those high deductibles are actually tapping down health insurance cost or healthcare cost because so many people are saying that's $7,000. I can't afford that, or I got to go to a free clinic. But Bill has got it absolutely right. You want to try to get health insurance to a point where people ask where do I get value for my health care money?
Let's use another one that is there is transparency, and just talk about that for a minute, because I think I got this from you. If you looked at what it costs to get heart bypass in one medical hospital in Plano, which is not far from where we are, $240,000, yet the average for all the other hospitals in the county is $164,000. So if you could do even a little bit of comparison shopping, you would save, $80,000 right there.
You would, but remember, health insurance kicks in.
Yes.
So do I really care if the difference is $160,000 to $200,000?
But again, if you had comparison shopping and transparency, just be very, very different. Okay, while we're talking about cost, we got to talk about Jonathan Gruber for just a minute. I know you've got a piece coming out with Investors Business Daily. I promised to post that. But he is the man who is kind of behind all of this. And he was arguing that the reason the costs are going up is because Donald Trump was elected as president. Now, you've got a very good piece coming out in Investors Business Daily sometime soon, so I'll alert people, in which you point out the obvious, and that is a lot of this happened long before Donald Trump even thought about running for the presidency.
In November 2015, United Healthcare decided they were going to, they announced that they would probably be pulling out. I did a piece in Forbes about 6 months later pointing out about how well their stock was doing after they decided they were going to pull out of Obamacare because it's such a money-losing deal. The Hill had a piece in, I think, around November 2015, saying that 12 insurers had pulled out, forcing some 800,000 people, I think, to lose their health insurance. The insurers exiting and premiums going up happened long before Donald Trump. But now the Democrats want to blame Donald Trump on this. thinking that most people simply won't realize that this started early on and that we predicted this happening early on.
And a lot of the pain has been postponed till now. As you well know, and President Obama was looking at this, some of the mandates that really increased the cost were not going to kick in until really after he was out of office. So in some respects, now the pain people are feeling go all the way back to 2010, don't they?
They do. And one of the things that's going to happen is the next round of increases, we're going to see those coming up in just a few months as we start heading into the fall. And it's going to create a lot of pressure on politicians out there to what are you going to do with these premiums going up so high?
So again, one of the things we recognize is that right now the American Health Care Act passed the House. It will go to the Senate. Now, if indeed the Senate passes it, and that's a big question, isn't it? There's going to have to be reconciliation and compromise because what the Senate comes up with is going to be different than the House. So it's
probably going to be different. Yeah, so it's still going to be a process. But going back to Bill's point, health insurance, because we were insulated from the cost, typically was more expensive than what you'd expect from a real consumer-driven system. But because Obamacare ignored all actuarial standards in creating what they did, that's it's the death spiral now in insurance that's really driving the cost, not the increase in medical technology and other uses and so forth.
So again, if the Republicans do pass something, and again, they might have to pass it just with Republican votes, it gets back to the Pottery Barn axiom, you break it, you pay for it, right? So again, some of the problems that you're dealing with healthcare are not going to be resolved easily because we're getting older, medical technology is more expensive, and because we are so
healthy. Baby boomers are moving into the Medicare system.
So there are all sorts of issues that are going to make the costs go up no matter who's in the White House, no matter who's in Congress, right?
That's right. They just don't have to be going up 50 or 75% a year.
That's right. Well, Dr. Merrill Matthews, great to have you with us. First of all, let's talk about what's available at ipi.org. We have next to you, first of all, we also have the Twitter account and Facebook account if people want to follow you. And then we have ipi.org. There's all sorts of articles that you and Tom and everybody have written. Talk about what's available on for our listeners.
Well, IPI covers a number of issues, tax issues, trade, communications and technology. We're big on that, intellectual property. So there's just a range of different, we don't do a lot on education. We don't do that much on the environment, but we do a lot on energy.
Yes, and you certainly have been bringing some of that to the table as well. So, again, any predictions before we run out of time of what you think will happen in the Senate, or is that just impossible to predict?
There's going to be a lot of pressure on McConnell to try to pull something off. Whether he can do it with the senators, it's just, given his slim lead in the Senate, it's going to be very difficult. But I think it's possible. It's just going to be difficult for him.
So again, as we mentioned to Diane just a minute ago, if it passes both the House and Senate and signed by the president, there won't be a penalty. But the reality is you still have to pay the penalty right now, right?
Except, remember, they made a lot of exceptions. So out of the 20-something million uninsured that they were tracking, 6 or 7 million paid the penalty, but another 12 million were able to get an exemption.
Yeah. And again, that exemption, I think it's Section 1501. You know, we've listed those before, but one of those would be some of those health sharing accounts, which some of us have done.
Yep.
Well, always great to have you in studio. We'll do it again real quickly, but let me just again mention that in the first hour we had Ken Timmerman with us for about half an hour talking about some of the issues related to foreign policy. The second hour we've had Dr. Merrill Matthews. And if you said, well, I didn't get through, but I wanted to ask a question, I suspect he'll still answer some of those questions at ipi.org.
He'll do his best.
He'll certainly do the best, and we'll be looking for your columns. And I can't wait to post that one from Investors Business Daily. Jonathan Gruber blaming that on Donald Trump just made my teeth ache, my hair hurt, whatever you want to use. And so, again, one of those issues we wanted to try to correct. Tomorrow we're going to talk about millennials, and we're actually going to have in studio with us Steve Cable, and he has done a lot of work on a lot of the statistics, facts, and figures. So I think you'll appreciate that. Friday, of course, our weekend edition, and we'll be talking also with Gary Frazier on Thursday about the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War. I want to thank Andrew and Elisa and Melissa for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.